And so when you talk about Bitcoin being a fundamental technology,
Yeah.
how important do you see it?
I see it as critical. I believe that Bitcoin has automated one of the central functions of the state, which is the seigniorage and management of money, of sound money. This is traditionally, has been a prerogative of the state, and in the modern period, the central banks. This is not to say that there is no longer a role for the state or even for central banks, but rather that there is now a particular function of these institutions that has been automated and made global and universal by design and default. And so there is no local, let's say, jurisdiction that Bitcoin emanates from. It is a-jurisdictional. That means a number of things. One, it's a kind of financial DMZ, or demilitarized zone, which, as we can see in a world of weaponized and politicized money, can actually be the precondition for trade between enemies. Because it is set up to be enemy money. It is presumed that your counterparty in the transaction is someone you don't know and don't trust. It also is something that anyone can make use of. So it is not the explicit purview of a favored class or a Cantillon effect of some kind. So I think initially, actually, what many nation states don't like about Bitcoin will be the very reason they come around to it, because they will recognize that they can benefit from its neutrality, not just lose out from its neutrality. And then finally, the importance of property. I mean, this is one of those fundamental rights, that the political theorists of the Enlightenment write about. And they often started with property because it is, in some ways, the clearest way of talking about ownership, ownness. In other words, what belongs to me versus, say, to someone else or to the community. And that question, it's never defined with 100% certainty. There's always a debate about where the boundaries of ownness kind of end, like where personal property begins to transition. But nevertheless, if you don't have some sense of personal property at all, then you set individuals up for, in effect, totalitarian control, whether that is the cage of norms, which political scientists Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson have written about, where the village lays claim to whatever it is you happen to possess, or whatever fortune you have. Nobody can rise too high because you're immediately cut down. That's a sort of more traditional small-scale society approach to this. Or the modern totalitarian state, where there is in fact no private property, and so anything you have can be confiscated at any time by the state. And so these are extremes, but if you don't have a theory of private property, of ownness, then it's really hard to justify any other rights politically. And so this is why Bitcoin is so important for the individual, because it actually enshrines in a material infrastructure a structure of ownership through ownership of private keys, and the ability to use those private keys in a self-sovereign way to transact with anybody you choose.
So that idea that any of your property can be taken by a totalitarian state, I understand that what you're getting there and the kind of states we're talking about. But at the same time, I'm from the UK, a Western liberal democracy.
Right.
But I can imagine an instant scenario right now where the state can take my property from me. And when I talk about my property, my home and my money.
Right.
So there are certain scenarios, say, for example, if I didn't pay tax, they can go into my bank, they can go straight into my bank account and take that money directly from the bank. And I can't stop it.
Right.
But I can also see scenarios, say, if perhaps I was involved in some kind of lawsuit which was a lawsuit that was unfair, but I lost it and I
Yeah.
had to pay the costs, I can have my home taken from me in those scenarios.
Right.
So how do you differentiate the two?
Right. I think often these political labels like liberal democracy and totalitarian state are used in very imprecise ways. Liberal democracy is used to describe the good states that we like, and totalitarian state is used to describe the bad states that we don't like.
Which are blurring now.
Right. So what is, totalitarianism? There's a history of theorizing it. One could say that what characterizes totalitarianism is a certain type of not mere outward compliance with the law, but a demand that people inwardly be in agreement with the law. So it is not enough to obey. One must enthusiastically obey and enthusiastically encourage or coerce others to obey. So it's a kind of colonization of the inner disposition of the human being that political theorists have described as totalitarian.
Right.
That said, whether or not the state is totalitarian in that regard, its ability to confiscate property, private property, without repercussions, defines its ambit of sovereignty. And so what's interesting about self-sovereignty is it's not saying this is the only category of sovereignty that can exist, but rather let's posit that the individual also has a form of sovereignty that is a counterpoint to the sovereignty of the state, so that the jurisdiction of the state cannot be said to penetrate more than a certain degree into the lives of each individual. That is also privacy. So, lo and behold, privacy, self-sovereignty, these are constituent components of a free society. A state that can confiscate property with complete impunity could, the moment it flips to being totalitarian and demands that ideological conformity, do so without any, in effect, civil society pushback.
Right. Okay. So when you think about this work that you're doing here with Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and you consider political structures, what is the end goal? And can it be summed up quite simply? When I think of decentralization, when people compare Bitcoin and Ethereum, and they refer to both being as decentralized, some will say one's more decentralized than the other. I prefer to think of directionally, is a blockchain, is a network becoming more or less decentralized? And I see as Bitcoin is constantly striving for more decentralization, and I see as Ethereum becoming more centralized. And that is how I differentiate the two. Is your work considered in a way where you're pushing for more freedom, avoiding heading down the totalitarian route? Can it be simplified like that?
That's right. Preserving a free society.
Okay.
Freedom is taken from us generally behind our backs and sometimes with our enthusiastic consent. If our theory of a good society is one that relies on people we agree with being in power, that is a hierarchical social structure. That means we have to constantly work, often through violence, to ensure that the right people are in power at all times, i.e. whoever we happen to agree with. What if we actually remembered some of the lessons of Enlightenment era political theory, which is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so how do you ensure power is not abused? It's not by making sure that the right people are in power. It's by setting power against itself, fragmenting it through a separation of powers, and then creating a system of checks and balances where no faction of power can rise too high. That is ultimately what preserves a free society. What we've seen happen instead is the consolidation of power in an elite faction of society. That's a kind of revolving door. private sector, public sector, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, central banks, large banking institutions, large financial institutions, policy. And so, in effect, this is a process that anthropologists have described again and again with regards to the collapse of complex societies. When the elites of a society become so entrenched and their interests aligned, what ends up happening is that society begins lurching into this kind of top-down imbalance where the elites colonize more and more of the resources of the society, and the productive economy of the bottom part of the society can no longer sustain them materially. And so you have a growing elite class that, like, regulatory capture is just one of the ways it exerts its power. But that is increasingly parasitic on the actual production of the bottom of the pyramid. And at some point, there's just resource limitations. Lynn Alden has spoken often about the energy supply crunch. Like, there's...
I mean, we're seeing that in the UK. I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah.
There's so many bits of work that we've been doing recently that are kind of converging into this conversation.
Yeah.
I recently made a film that's about 2 weeks away from being released, where I went out to study inflation in the UK. What people understood about it. Post filming that, we've had an energy crisis in the UK, and the energy crisis has gone from the point of people expecting to pay maybe 1,200 euro in energy costs to a predicted up to 6,000. The only way that's been protected is by the government borrowing a massive amount of money to subsidize the energy costs.
Right.
At an individual and a business level, because businesses would have closed and people could not heat their homes, and we already have people living in poverty.
Right.
So we've had this crunch not only at the base of society, but also in the middle classes, because the middle class is so stretched that their disposable income doesn't stretch so far.
Right.
Add to that rising interest rates with people coming off fixed rate mortgages, we're expecting there's going to be a surplus of housing as people can't afford to pay for their homes.
Right.
That. We also had a conversation yesterday with Ovik Roy, and you know Ovik very well.
Yeah.
Love him. And we were discussing the cost of living crisis, which isn't just here, which is happening everywhere.
Right.
Everything you've just said to me kind of points to one of the things I'd made a note to Ovik about. And also harks back to a conversation I had with, do you know Dominic Frisby?
No.
He's a UK comedian. What would you call him? A comedian?
Yeah, he's like a comedian, actor, political commentator, Bitcoiner, a bit all sorts.
Yeah, he's written books on taxations, and he made a very clear point. He said, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said that we used to have a society based on houses with one income.
Yeah.
And that you could afford a house and a car and a holiday and your kids.
Right.
We've now got families where we've got two incomes where they can't maybe afford a house or can't afford to pay the bills. He said we've had society stretched. And one of the things I wanted to say to Ovik is, I talked to him about this property, this place called Terminus House. It's in a town called Harlow. It's one of the most deprived, 20 most deprived towns in the country. They're so short of social housing, they've started turning old office blocks into blocks of social housing.
Yeah.
Essentially, the UK version of a favela.
Yeah.
Ghettoized,
Right.
dangerous.
I know we brought it up
blocks.
yesterday, but it's worth looking
this
at.
is
It's shocking.
Now, for me, it's shocking. Like, I'm from the UK. Despite what anyone thinks about the UK, we have quite a civil society that like protects the most vulnerable and the poorest. We have a good social structure, whether it's with health or housing. But we get to the point where we're starting to house single parents and families alongside criminals into these environments, which are burdened by poverty, drugs. This, to me, is a sign of a collapsing culture and a collapsing country, which is happening on the back of massive GDP growth over the last 2 decades. So everything you've just said to me there, you've just pointed to that. This is the elites that have taken up the resources, which has left very little for those at the bottom. And here we go.
That's inside.
That's inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, look, it's not easy to house everybody who needs a home. But at the same time, to me, it's just another signal of many signals that I'm seeing in that we have squeezed the poorest and we're squeezing the middle class out of being able just to function.
Right. You're absolutely right. One of the things we see too in late stage societies or late stage empires is the increased emphasis on rent seeking as opposed to new productive growth. And so what happens, as the elites begin to feel the resource crunch, because they feel it too, even though, they have more sort of padding, they begin to search for new sources of revenue. And the easiest way to find new sources of revenue is to extract rents. And so, we've seen rent-based business models, everywhere, including in areas of the economy that are truly productive, like software. I mean, software as a service is now like the standard model. You no longer can like perpetually own software. In effect, you have to pay a rent for it.
I noticed that even recently with Microsoft Word.
Yeah.
I wanted Microsoft Word, and it wanted me to have a subscription.
Exactly.
I was like, hold on, I'm sure I used to pay like, I don't know the amount, £100, £50, whatever, and I would just own that software.
Right. Exactly. But yeah, so subscription, rent, whatever it is, this is part of what has caused a boom in growth of certain industries, like real estate, like software. But it is also presenting a challenge because, in effect, it creates ongoing sort of operating expenditure for the end user, or the previously what we would have called the owner, but now it's the client or the customer. And so this also kind of chips away in a sense at the sense of property ownership. Like, what does it mean if I'm always renting my property? What is my sphere of ownness that is, so to speak, inviolable? Where does that begin and end?
You'll own nothing and be happy.
Yeah.
Well, and is this why we've seen, or one of the reasons we've seen the likes of BlackRock, who now own, I think, is it 80,000 properties, and a lot of these big funds moving into owning properties on a scarce resource, which means there's less properties available for people to buy. It pushes up the price of the properties. It pushes up the prices of rents. Is that one of the reasons we've seen that?
Certainly. I mean, if you're looking to diversify in a world where the productive economy is, hitting some limits, then you're going to want to create areas of your portfolio that can collect rents on, what is already built, what is already there. And so this is where we get into the question of, how do we actually grow the pie? Like, how do we move from a rent-seeking economy to a more net new productive economy? And that actually appears to be a question of resource abundance / scarcity. So, we can have a growing economy, but we need a certain type of energy subsidy for that, or not subsidy, supply for that. That energy crunch that is being experienced now throughout the world is constraining, real GDP growth. It's going to constrain new industries. It's going to push down rent extraction further and further into the pyramid. And so this is why, I think on the left in particular, which tends to be, very concerned about the poor, the middle class, those who are economically struggling, there often is a real disconnect on this issue because they haven't thought about energy as the underpinning of all prosperity. And so there is an emphasis on redistribution, which, you can debate different redistribution models. But ultimately, if the pie isn't growing, then you're redistributing smaller and smaller units of value that are themselves losing value to more and more people, which is a recipe for a revolution.